In our last video, we talked about God's clear instructions given in the Old Testament about keeping the Sabbath. But didn't Jesus change all of that when he came on the scene? Anyone who reads the gospel accounts of the life of Jesus will notice that the religious leaders of his day were quick to accuse him and his disciples of disobeying the Sabbath commandment. In John 9, after Jesus had healed a blind man on the Sabbath, some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath." Were they right? The simplest answer is yes and no. Were they correct in believing a man of God would be keeping the Sabbath? Yes, absolutely. But the problem came from their mistaken ideas about just what keeping the Sabbath meant. To explain that, we need to take a moment for a brief history lesson. Centuries before Jesus walked the earth, the nation of Israel had experienced one of history's great tragedies. After the death of King Solomon, the northern 10 tribes of Israel spent 3 centuries rebelling against God and his laws. So God allowed the Assyrians to take them into captivity, from which they never returned. For the next century and a half, the tiny kingdom of Judah struggled on, gradually slipping further and further from God. After sending prophets like Jeremiah to warn them, God withdrew his protection and allowed Jerusalem to be destroyed and the Jews to be carried away into captivity by the Babylonians. As they grieved for the loss of their homes and their families and their country, God inspired the prophet Ezekiel to tell them that they were in captivity because they had not executed my judgments, but had despised my statutes, profaned my Sabbaths, and their eyes were fixed on their fathers' idols. Yet in the midst of their anguish, God also gave them hope through the faithful prophets like Jeremiah, who was inspired to tell them that if they repented of their idolatry and Sabbath breaking, after 70 years, God would allow their descendants to return to their land. The Jewish religious leaders tried to find a way to prevent falling short of God's law again. They saw the law of God, especially the Sabbath, as a beautiful garden. But they also knew that they and their ancestors had trampled all over God's garden. They concluded that the best way to protect this garden was to construct a fence or a hedge around the law. And just like a physical fence, it had to be constructed outside of the garden itself. If no one crossed the fence, no one could trample in the garden. So they set about creating a set of rules for Sabbath observance that were far more stringent than what God had commanded. And they began to judge one another by their rules instead of God's. Fast forward to Jesus and the Pharisees. In their zeal to protect the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders had turned a blessing from God into a burden. For them, keeping God's Sabbath mainly focused on what could not be done. When the Pharisees confronted Jesus over the Sabbath, Jesus made it clear that they were missing the point of God's day of rest. He reminded them the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And then he added, therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. That last phrase tells us something very important. If anyone understood the Sabbath and how to keep it, it was Jesus Christ, the Lord of the Sabbath. So how did he keep it? The gospel writers give us several insights into this, and one of the clearest is from the 4th chapter of the book of Luke. Luke 4:16 states that it was Jesus' custom to go into the synagogue every Sabbath and participate in worship. His example shows us he believed that God's ancient instruction to have a holy convocation or sacred assembly each Sabbath was an important part of obeying God. The Sabbath is a day for the faithful to come together to learn about God's plan, his way of life, and how we are to live. The conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders of his day was never over whether to keep the Sabbath. The issue was about how to keep it. On more than one occasion, Jesus chided the religious leaders for exalting their own traditions above God's clear commands. But Jesus never criticized them for keeping the Sabbath, only for the way they insisted it must be kept. In spite of their self-righteous accusations, Jesus never broke God's instructions for the Sabbath. He told his disciples, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law, till all is fulfilled." So why is his example so important? It's good to know what Jesus personally did about observing the Sabbath, But there's something else we need to consider. The Apostle John wrote, "Those who say they live in God should live their lives as Jesus did." Christ's example is more than a piece of biblical trivia. It's supposed to show us how we should live. Is that really the way his disciples and the early church, the first Christians, understood this? Did they still believe in keeping the weekly Sabbath even after all that he explained to them? In the next video in this series, we'll see what Scripture and history tell us about those first believers and how they understood Jesus' teaching and example. We hope you'll continue with us on this journey of discovery.